Well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're joining us. Thank you to join us on this lunch hour break. And of course, we have the privilege to have Preston Sprinkle with us once again, who we're trying to, every time we meet with him, convince him to become a free Methodist. But he's right on the fence, depending on which podcast you listen to his. But we're so grateful for his heart. As I was thinking about, especially this conversation, which we realize is going to be so important, not only today, but as we move forward. I'm grateful for someone who has already been deliberate about thinking about it. I think in many ways, prophetically, in a season past, God put it on his heart along with his spouse, just to say, how do we make these bridges into a community of people that God deeply loves, but we know in some ways don't fully understand how to have a conversation. So I just so appreciate everything he's written and shared openly, both with the tensions that I think he's been able to navigate with great grace. And he has just been a learner on the journey, which I have so appreciated. And then a voice to us in the church and church leadership and how to, again, bless and move forward and reach people and understand heart. I would also say this as one of your superintendents that I think after we've come out of this pandemic, we knew that this would be one of the hot topics, so to say, that our churches will have to be wrestling with, especially us in Southern California. And so I am encouraged to know that you'll want to learn and grow and lean into this. And we have lots of resources, of course, on this topic, but no better person than I can think of to come and speak to this, particularly on the issue that we'll be talking about with transgender issues, which I think is another added complexity to this whole topic. But Preston, of course, has been leaning in on this, and he's got a voice and not all the answers, but he certainly knows how to ask good questions, and that I'm thankful for. So I'll pray, and then Preston, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll enjoy our time together. Father, thank you so much for Preston, his life, his family. God, I also pray for his schedule, as I know it is so full in this season, and so grateful for his time to be with us. I pray that you would bless our conversation. We would honor you with the things we say, and that, Lord, you will help us to receive what we need to hear. So as we continue this conversation, I pray that you would be so very present in Jesus' name. And all of God's amazing people said, amen. All right, all yours, Preston. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be back with the FMC. I know I'm just here in my basement with my books all around, but I've hung out with so many of you out there. I'm sure that even you watching, some of you, maybe we've met, maybe hugged, maybe shaking hands or seen each other from a distance. So it's good to at least be back with you virtually. I really mean it. I love the FMC. Gotten to know many pastors over the last few years, and I love that grace, truth tension that I've been an advocate for a long time. And I just see it so much in the FMC. I just see a lot of humility and genuineness to want to love people, walk with people, and but also a strong commitment to the biblical authority. I know you guys have been through a lot and some tough conversations. And man, I'm just so proud that the FMC has held strong to following God's word, in a time when it's not popular. So I do want to focus specifically on the transgender conversation for the next hour and a half. And there's several reasons for doing that. I think first of all, in the past, LGBT, even as an acronym that's thrown around all over the place, I think sometimes we have collapsed gender identity questions with sexuality questions. And even the more LGBTQ plus is thrown around, that kind of fosters that collapsing. We sometimes use the term LGBT as a synonym for gay, but it's just not. There's a big difference. I mean, there's some overlap, but there's a big difference between LGB and the T. And in our current cultural moment, if you have an internet connection and pay attention to the news and, go outside your home once in a while, you will see that the T aspect of this conversation has really become front and center, politically, socially, and in many ways, it's becoming a major ethical or proposing a sort of series of ethical questions that, to be honest, I mean, most pastors haven't really thought through. Most Christian leaders haven't thought through. So That's why several years ago I said, man, I really need to dive into the T aspect of this conversation. And the more I dove in, the more I realized how complicated it can be, and how confusing it can be, and how there's just a lot of different thoughts and opinions out there in pop culture and pop church culture. And most of the time, people really don't know what they're talking about, just to be blunt and honest. I'll read stuff and I'm like, man, what happened here? And I don't claim to have all the answers at all. But I have devoted a lot of time and energy to try to sort through this conversation so that we can love God and love others well. So just to acknowledge which I guess is probably obvious to most, if not all of you, I don't identify as trans. I don't experience gender dysphoria. So everything I'm talking about is coming in a sense from a distance. I don't have the lived experience. I've done my best, I believe, to understand that lived experience, the diversity of trans experiences. So I do bring like a lot of conversations and relationships with me as I talk, but I can't speak directly to what it's like to, for instance, experience gender dysphoria, feel like I'm not at home in my body, or several other experiences. And that's why this talk is by definition incomplete. Like I would highly encourage all of us, if you haven't done so already, to really engage in relationships and conversations, listening conversations with people who identify as trans. One more thing. I'm going to return to this at the very end, but this topic has been so politicized and polarized, especially in the last year or so. And I just want to encourage us all to not view this topic simply through a political lens. I'm going to assume a lot of us have political commitments. Maybe we even listen to certain political news outlets and commentators. And I do the same. I try to listen to a broad range of different voices just to stay in touch with what's going on. But man, every time I do, and the way I hear them handle the trans conversation, it's extremely polarizing. And we need to pay attention to certain things going on in culture, for sure. I think we need to be good stewards of our surrounding culture. But man, if all we did is take our cues from the clickbait headlines that we often read about, we're not going to be in a good position to love God and love others well in this conversation. So much of what I'm going to talk about will not be some of the political stuff. I'll touch on it at the end, but I do want to really focus on how can we as ministers of the gospel believe the truth in God's word, what he has said about humanity, and how can we love people well, especially those in this conversation who are wrestling with their bodies, wrestling with their minds, and are sometimes wrestling with some really debilitating things that going on between their body and mind disconnect. So with that, let me go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my screen here. I do have a slideshow that I think will be helpful as we engage this issue. We've got lots of charts and graphs and different things, and hopefully this will be helpful for you to follow along. 8 things every Christian should know about the transgender conversation. There's actually about 80 that we could talk about, but for the sake of time, we're going to cover the kind of top 8 that I think are really important for every Christian to understand. First of all, the trans conversation is about both concepts and people, and both are crucial. This is my first point for a reason. I think this is foundational to understand that if we just try to love people, or specifically trans people, without wrestling with some of the really tough concepts in this conversation, we might end up not loving people really well. There's a great book out there called When Helping Hurts. It has to do with kind of like poverty relief and how some people are well-intentioned with wanting to help the poor, but sometimes if they don't understand some of the economic or even psychological complexity of poverty, they can be doing things that end up hurting people in the long run. And I think that's a perfect analogy for this conversation. I know lots of people who have just huge hearts for people. They just have, huge empathy. They just want to love people well. They're sick of seeing people bullied and mistreated, and all those are values we should all have, right? But sometimes people don't do the hard work of asking the hard conceptual questions, and then they end up maybe helping people in ways that might end up hurting them down the road. So we do need to wrestle with both concepts, and we need to love people well. Vice versa, if all we do is wrestle with concepts and we don't love people well, then we're useless in that sense too. I mean, we can't just sit and here I am in a basement filled with books. So feeling a little convicted here, but we can't just sit in the basement filled with books and that's it. Like we have to wrestle with the concepts so that we can love people the way God loves them. Now, for this conversation, for this next 45 minutes of my talk, and then we'll see how the Q&A goes, but for my talk, I do want to lean heavily into the concepts in this conversation, and that is intentional. So this will be a little one-sided, but I really feel like some of the concepts really need to be thought through, and that's going to take it sometimes takes a while. I can't really rush the conceptual side of this conversation, but I just want you to know that even though we're going to lean heavily on the concepts today, my motivation is still the same. It's so that we would love people well. All right, the first thing to really that we really have to understand is that sex and gender often mean different things. Now, and let me just say this too. Some of the things I say might be like old news to a lot of you, or some of you, and other things might seem brand new. Okay, so I might go deep and I might kind of state the obvious, and I'm just trying to make sure we're all kind of following together. So if this is kind of like old news to you, I'm sorry. For some people, it's brand new. Yeah, sex and gender. The terms sex and gender are often used differently in this conversation, but just in culture as a whole. So if I was going to ask you a question, how many genders are there? Don't answer that. You can't answer that question until you ask the question, what do you mean by gender? Because the term gender is defined so many different ways by so many different people that you can't engage in a thoughtful conversation until you understand what people mean by the terms they're using. And quite frankly, sometimes they don't know what they mean by the terms they're using. Now, sex and gender, these terms used to be used as synonyms, okay, up until about the 1960s, 1970s. Sex and gender were used interchangeably. If you're a male or female, that was your sex, that was your gender. They are still used interchangeably today by a lot of people. But in the trans conversation, especially, sex and gender are used to refer to different aspects of the human experience. Now, some people already are protesting like, no, they should still mean the same thing. And maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. I'm just trying to point out the fact that people use these terms differently. So this is more of just a helpful relational piece to understand that we can't really engage in thoughtful relationships if we don't understand that these two terms are used differently, even if you don't think they should be used differently. Okay. Now, sex, for the most part, it's the easiest one. Biological sex. Sex refers to biological sex. So an organism is male or female if it is structured to perform one of the respective roles in reproduction, and there is no other widely accepted biological classification of the sexes. So put differently, Homo sapiens, like most mammalian species, are sexually dimorphic. This is a Earth is round and not flat sort of scientific fact. And now I can get in trouble for saying that because some people say, no, biological sex is a social construct, or I just saw an article the other day, the myth of biological sex. And so there are some kind of really radical fringe ideas that even biological sex isn't a thing. That, just in case you're wondering, that's just not a scientifically credible view. So yeah, I mean, I'm just going to take it for granted. Humans are sexually dimorphic. Male and female are the two terms used to describe the sexual dimorphism. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, but what about intersex? Not everybody is actually male or female. I don't want to get too deep into this, but just because this is becoming more and more popular to kind of bring up in the midst of this conversation, it is true that a small percentage of people are born with what medical professionals call disorders or differences of sex development. These refer to some kind of atypical feature in someone's sexual anatomy and or their sex chromosomes. So, for instance, most people have XY or XX chromosomes. Some people, though, have XXY or XXXY chromosomes. Some people have atypical features in their sexual anatomy, and I'm not going to get into all the reasons that might cause that. Now, there's about 16 to 20 different intersex conditions, disorders of sex development. Here's a really important thing to understand, though, and something you rarely see people acknowledge, is that roughly 99% of people who have an intersex condition, not just 99% of people, but 99% of people with an intersex condition are clearly male or female. Intersex does not mean neither male nor female. Intersex does not mean some kind of third or other sex. I would argue that intersex itself, the existence of intersex people, of which I have several friends who have an intersex condition, that doesn't mean sex is not binary. It just means that a small percentage of people have atypical features in the sex anatomy, or even a very small percentage, 1% of intersex people might be, the condition might be so severe that they are quite literally both male and female. I've got a friend who has full male anatomy, full female anatomy, XX and XY chromosomes. I don't know how that works. It's a very rare condition, but they are both, they're not one or the other. That's just the way it is. A beautiful, sold out believer in Jesus, by the way. But that is, that simply having an intersex condition doesn't mean you're kind of both male or female, or neither male nor female. Most of these conditions are very minor variations. Okay, that's where the easy part ends, because now we enter into the wide, nebulous world of gender. I'm going to give some basic agreed upon definitions of gender. This is a pretty standard definition. That gender, in distinction from sex, refers to the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. The most important kind of subcategory of gender is gender identity. Now, I'm going to assume most of you have come across this term. Most of you might even be able to define it, just offhand. It's become very, very popular thing to discuss today. People say, should bathrooms be divided based on biological sex or gender identity? Or maybe even more controversially, should athletics be based on gender identity or biological sex? So gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, both, or neither. And then you have this other thing called gender role. These are sort of like the cultural expectations for how males and females should act. And really this comes down to just the cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity. So these are the most widely accepted definitions of gender. But again, people will say sex is different than gender, and then they'll define gender, and then 2 sentences later, they're going to use the term gender in a way that doesn't match their definition. It happens. Honestly, it happens 99% of the time. Even when I'm reading books or talking to really smart people, their use of the term gender doesn't even match their own kind of definition. One of my, as a nerd who sits in his basement with his books, one of the things that I do for entertainment is when I'm reading a book on gender, I'll take the way they define gender up front. They usually have a page defining gender, and then throughout the book, whenever I see the term gender, I will literally I'll cross it out, cross out gender, and I'll insert their own definition, and then reread the sentence. And it's hilarious. Even like, gender identity is one's internal sense of gender. Okay, but you can't use a term that's under the definition as part of the definition. So if you say gender identity is one's internal sense of gender, then that means gender identity is one's internal sense of one's internal sense. And I guess it's kind of like 2 mirrors facing each other. It's the internal sense of one's internal sense of it. It just doesn't make any sense. So all that to say, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but this is actually, I think, from a relational standpoint, this is really important. When you're in conversations with people, maybe somebody who comes out as trans in your church, or a relative, or a friend, or whatever, and you're trying to understand their experience, and you absolutely should try to understand their experience, try to understand their identity. You should have special lenses up, or maybe be paying attention to how they're using the term gender. And I don't say that so that you can kind of point out their inconsistencies, because there's a good chance they will use it in kind of more inconsistent ways. But just to avoid you being confused and therefore not being able to enter into a relationship, just know that the term gender is just, it can be used in a very wide variety of ways. So gender dysphoria, yeah, this is the medical term used to describe the distress associated with the incongruence one might experience between their gender identity and their biological sex. It's important to know that not everyone who identifies as trans experiences gender dysphoria. In fact, if you go down in age, like all the way down to like Gen Z, I would say a large majority of people who identify as trans or non-binary or gender queer, gender fluid, or another gender identity, a high percentage probably wouldn't even be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I forget the percentage on Gen Z. Depends on what area of the country you're at, how many identify as trans. But it's a much higher percentage than people who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria as a diagnosable psychological condition is actually very rare. The DSM, the latest edition, says 0.014% of the population would be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. That's a much, much lower percentage than people who would identify as trans. So let me go back to one my a question I asked earlier. How many genders are there? And you should be asking, well, what do you mean by gender? If you define gender the way a lot of people define it as, or gender identity as one's internal sense of self, then in a sense it's become so subjective and individualized that there's 7 billion plus genders, really, if you define gender as one's just internal sense of self, because now you've reduced it to such an individualistic thing. So this actually helps. Hopefully it helps turn down the temperature on some of these conversations when people are ripping out their hair because their kid just said there's more than 2 genders, and gender's a spectrum, all this stuff. But we need to calm down and say, okay, well, how are you using the term gender? Because according to your definition, you might be right. I might not think it's helpful to define gender that way, but if you go with your definition, then yeah, you can see where people would say there's all, umpteen genders. Okay, this is on a conceptual level, which has massive practical pastoral ramifications. This would be kind of the essential foundational question from which our pastoral response should flow. If someone experiences incongruence between their biological sex and their gender identity or internal sense of self, then which one are they and why? And to answer the why question, I wrote a whole 300-page book called Embodied. If you want a deeper dive, you can check that out. And this is kind of in the opening chapter, this is kind of my leading question, like which one are they and why? If one is biologically female, but they identify as male, their internal sense, which one are they? And most of you, if not all of you, are going to say, well, they're male. That's what their body says. And I do agree with that, by the way. But why? Why does the body, for instance, rule out the brain if there's incongruence? If you were to take out your brain and put it into another person's body, is that new human? Is that you? Do you go with your brain or did you stay with your body? Like say you just swap brains with somebody. Okay. If you're married, you're swap brains with your spouse. Like, which one are you? Which one are they? At least acknowledge like, oh, well, that's a little more complicated than I thought. And that's why I think this why question is really important. We do need to understand the issues and engage them. And we don't all need to become specialists in transgender identities. But in 2021, as a Christian leader, I do think that we do have a pastoral responsibility to do some study on this and really wrestle with some of the complexity. All right, number 3, third point everybody needs to understand is that trans people are diverse. If you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. And of course, all humans are different. No single experience is like somebody else's experience. But I think it's easy for non-trans identified people to have a kind of one size fits all view of what it means to be trans. But I would say, well, I don't want to make it. I almost said, but I didn't. I'm not going to say it. But I almost said, there's a lot more diversity within the T than even the LGB. But as I think about that, no, there's I don't know if I want to actually say that. um, but the trans conversation, that there are unexpected varieties of trans experiences. Maybe I should put it like that. Here's just a few different kind of more clinically based views on different trans experiences. There's early onset gender dysphoria. People experience severe dysphoria from the time they were 2 or 3 years old. I've got friends who, from their earliest memories, they just felt like specifically their biological sex was not who they were, and they were profoundly distressed over this. Some people didn't experience it early on. They experienced it late, maybe in their teenage years. And there's another new thing called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which we'll get to in a second, which is a kind of a whole other kind of trans experience. There's a whole movement today that says you don't need to have gender dysphoria to be trans. If you say you're trans, you're trans. We see this in a lot of kind of, I would say, some of the more celebrity trans identities that we keep coming across. Anyway, I can't speak for one's lived experience, but it does seem that the bar is kind of set a little low of what it means to actually be trans. Autogenophelia is one that's rarely talked about, but is pretty widespread. This has to do with certain biological males, certain trans identified biological males whose trans experience is linked to almost like an erotic desire to view themselves as a woman. They're almost like infatuated with the sexual idea of inhabiting a woman's body. Now, let me be crystal clear. That is not a blanket statement about all trans people or even all biologically male trans people, but it's more common than I think people make it out to be. More and more psychologists are coming out saying, man, I'm working with trans people or who have gender dysphoria, and it seems to be clearly linked to past trauma or even internalized misogyny. This is a big one among biological females, that it's fairly common for their discomfort with their female biological sex is due to really a low or a really bad view of what it means to be a woman. Maybe they're raised in a context where womanness was really seen as bad and terrible and lesser than men, and sometimes they internalize that. Sometimes internalized homophobia is an issue. I just talked to a guy, Scott Nugent, who transitioned. This is crazy. He was a lesbian, married to a woman, and it was kind of more of a butch-ish lesbian, and but she was a strong Catholic, and her family was strong Catholics, and so they had a really, really hard time with their marriage. And so out of this disdain, this internalized homophobia, I don't want to be gay anymore, he ended up transitioning. These are his own words. Like, he transitioned to male so that they would have the kind of semblance of a heterosexual marriage. So he even says it was out of kind of religiously motivated homophobia, is how he puts it, that led to my transition. Then you have a whole growing number of people who are detransitioning. You've probably seen this in the news. I mean, a lot of younger 20-something, usually females, look back and say, man, I was rushed through hormones and transitioning and had a double mastectomy, and I was just a confused teenager that was dealing with all kinds of other stuff, and people rushed me through this transition process, and now I'm transitioning back to the best of my ability to my biological sex. So you could take each one of these, and some of these experiences are vastly different than another experience. It even would challenge the, I guess, more progressive approach to this that says, no, if you're trans, then you should transition, and it's unjust to prevent people from transitioning. But even if I was extremely progressive and I was very pro transitioning, and someone asked me, do you think trans people should transition? I would say, well, which trans person? I mean, if somebody's dealing with past trauma and that's what's causing their gender dysphoria, then hopefully the most thoughtful, progressive person should be able to say, well, I don't know if that's healthy to transition. What if we deal with the past trauma and that relieves their gender dysphoria? Wouldn't that be better than putting them on a lifelong diet of cross-sex hormones and going through surgeries that can increase a lot of health risks? Um, what about people that don't have gender dysphoria? Should they I mean, there's just should people be allowed to transition? Which one? Leaving aside just the ethics of that whole question. Okay, this is something we all need to be very aware of, especially if you're in youth ministry, or if you have a church with youth ministry, or if your discipleship ministry involves youth. So it should be all of us, right? If youth is in the purview of what you're doing as a Christian minister, there has been a sudden spike over the last 10 years in teens identifying as trans, and this has been labeled rapid onset gender dysphoria. Rapid onset describes the suddenness by which these teens seem to come out as trans. And this is a case where even within the diversity of experiences, a lot of these cases sound very, very similar. The parent says, my kid just came home. They told me they're non-binary and they want they, them pronouns. And this came out of nowhere. That there was no evidence that they were wrestling with their gender. There's no evidence that they were wrestling with this as a kid. Then I looked and all their friends at school, a lot of their friends at school are non-binary or trans or gender queer. Their favorite teacher just transitioned. And there seems to be something in the social waters that's playing some role here. That's what rapid onset gender dysphoria is. Now, lots of debates about this, okay? But the one thing that's not debated, these are just facts, that there has been a massive spike in teenagers, especially females, coming out as trans with no prior evidence of gender dysphoria. This graph is taken from, I think this is New Zealand, like a gender clinic in New Zealand. I mean, you can see, look down at like 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. And then you begin to see in 2012, 13, 14, this hockey stick spike. What's interesting is that's the time when teenagers started to get smartphones and when social media really started to take off. And it doesn't matter which Western country you look at, the same thing is true of every single Western country. Wealthy, mostly white Western countries. That's a whole nother conversation. This one's from the UK. And this is one where you see this kind of just interesting inversion of the sex ratio. So in the past, gender dysphoria primarily affected males like 2 to 1. For every one female that had gender dysphoria, 2 males had it. Well, now among teenagers in every Western country, it's completely flipped. Now it's like 2 to 3 females for every male. So that raises a huge question. What's in the water? Like, what's going on? Why are so many people identifying as trans? Now, without getting into all the details, let me just say, then this is a super debated point. People often say, whenever I talk on trans stuff, they're like, well, Preston, that's controversial. I'm like, okay, every single word out of my mouth, every single word out of anybody's mouth as it involves a trans conversation is controversial. So we just kind of need to get over it and just back up our claims, look at evidence, and just not be afraid of saying something that's controversial, because if you open your mouth and say the word trans, you're controversial. Okay. So yes, this is controversial. Everything's controversial. Having done a lot of thinking and research on this, I'm going to say without a doubt, at least for some teenagers, their social environment has played a role in maybe a significant role in influencing their trans identity and or even some gender dysphoria that they might experience. We know that eating disorders, which is kind of a body-mind thing, is socially contagious. We know that other things like suicidality is socially contagious. We also know that teenage females just factually are more susceptible to social contagion and are primarily susceptible with body image body dysphoria type issues. And so just from what we know about human nature, um, I think it's very, it rests on sound evidence to at least raise a question. Is there something socially that's playing some role here? And yeah, the evidence is just overwhelming, especially as it comes to like social media influence. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that transition as a teenager, detransition as a young 20 something, and they all say the same thing. I was bathing myself with YouTube and Reddit and Tumblr 6 to 8 to 10 hours a day, just absorbing a certain gender ideology. And now they look back and say, I needed somebody to cut off my internet. I needed to, now, that's not advice to parents because sometimes that could really backfire, but they would just say, I had a steady drip largely from online communities of this ideology that I now look back and say, this was not helpful at all. Now there's so many different directions I can go pastorally here. I'm hoping at least being aware of this will give you kind of a running start to start asking those pastoral questions. But again, leaving aside the ethics of transitioning, okay, just from so if you had no problem with somebody transitioning on an ethical level, we should all still be, and I don't care how progressive you are, you still should be a little nervous with teens transitioning, or especially teens being kind of rushed through medical transitioning. And that's, I say that because there seems to be an obvious social contagion happening among a lot of teens that they're in an environment at 16, 17, 18 that they might not be in at 20, 22, 23. And that's exactly what so many detransitioners are saying. They said, I was just so knee deep in this social environment that once I removed myself from that, the dysphoria lessened, if not going away, and my desire to transition wasn't there anymore. There's actually several lawsuits happening. A big one in the UK with Kiara Bell, who was rushed through transitioning as a teenager, detransitioned as an early 20-something, and she she sued the gender clinic and won. In fact, the high court in the UK has now outlawed giving puberty blockers without parental consent to people under 18 because of this case. Sweden last month, 2 months ago, just outlawed puberty blockers to people under 18 and cross-sex hormones because they said these are largely experimental, and we're seeing all kinds of problems, especially as people are coming out saying, I was a confused teenager dealing with mental health stuff, and you guys pumped me full of testosterone, and now I have to bear the irreversible effects for the rest of my life. So this is a big deal, and I'm in the midst of exploring ways in which parents, youth leaders, youth mentors can effectively walk with somebody who might be in this kind of rapid onset way of this group of people to help them to not rush into transitioning. Look, if an adult who knows all the health risks, who knows the pros and cons, who has a fully developed brain, still wants to transition, again, that still raises ethical questions. But if an adult wants to do it, that's one thing. But a 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old, I just think, again, if I was an atheist who hated the Bible, I would have huge reservations about that. And us as caretakers of this generation, we need to be very aware of that and explore ways in which we can really walk with people who are wrestling with this. Let's spend just a brief time looking at the Bible, or even for the sake of time, I'll kind of just summarize a biblical theology of sex and gender. So, biological sex. Well, let me say this: our bodies are a significant part of human identity. Now, not just our bodies, like that statement, our bodies are a significant part of human identity. That's a basic Christian anthropology. Like shouldn't be that disputed. Okay. Our bodies are a significant part of human identity, but I want to push it one step further and say specifically our our sexed bodies are a significant part of human identity. Genesis 1:27, arguably the most important verse about human nature in the Bible. It's where we first read about humans bearing God's image. It's also where we read about males and females being equal in the sight of God. And all my FMC brothers and sisters said amen, right? Some of my reformed conservative, never mind. Genesis Genesis 1:27, God created mankind, humankind in his own image. He created them in the image of God. He created them male and female. And I point this out. I didn't get the highlighting right. Don't read into the different colored of yellow. That doesn't mean, that's just me making a mistake. But notice the correlation between bearing God's image and being created male and female. The poetic kind of symmetry here links these two concepts together. Part of how we manifest and bear God's image in the world is through our embodied sex. Our biological sex is not an insignificant part of human identity, or to put it positively, biological sex is a significant part of human identity. Now, that goes against the modern way of thinking about human nature in pop culture, and even in large strands of Christian culture, because in 2021 in the West, your internal sense of who you are it has become the central piece of human identity. Like, you are in control of your own identity. The thought of somebody else, a higher power or creation, imposing your identity upon you, is how people might put it, that's offensive. I will choose my identity. That's not a biblical view. God identifies us, and our biological sex is part of how God, our creator, has identified us. Now, in a fallen world, that might not sit well with people. In fact, some people might experience debilitating distress over that, but that doesn't change the theological fact that this body, this sexed body of yours, is part of the identity that your creator has given you. That's a 4-minute summary of kind of a biblical theology of the body and identity. I have not really seen, and I wrestle with this in my book, I've not seen a really compelling case that gives kind of a counterpoint to what I said. And what I said is, again, it's kind of basic Christian anthropology, but it's being so challenged now by Western contemporary way of thinking that we do need to kind of, revisit it and understand it. Now, having said that, number 5 and number 6 kind of go together. Number 5, biological sex is a significant part of human identity. Number 6, most gender stereotypes come from culture and not the Bible. To put it differently, the Bible does not morally mandate cultural norms of masculinity and femininity. This is huge. I think it's problematic in many circles in the church. And I also think it underlies, oddly enough, ironically enough, it underlies a lot of trans ideology about what it means to be male or female. Let me unpack this a bit. Biologically speaking, most males will naturally act in stereotypically masculine ways. So whatever comes to your mind when I say masculine, okay, we all have probably the same images. Yeah, there's when I say most, I mean like more than 50% of biological males will probably fit within that masculine kind of way of acting and behaving and thinking. Most females, more than 50%, will naturally, biologically resonate with more culturally expected ways of being feminine. However, 2 important howevers here. However, number 1, those are generalities, not absolutes. So most boys like rough and tumble play and aren't as agreeable as women, or aren't as, I hesitate saying emotional, because anger and lust are emotions, and those are very much a masculine kind of struggle. um, yeah, but you know where I'm going. So most males will act in stereotypically masculine ways, but some won't, and that's okay. And it's not morally mandated. The Bible does not morally mandate that males should act in culturally defined terms of masculinity. There's nothing immoral about a male being terrible at sports and crying during movies. And yet there is this kind of unstated air in the church that does make less than masculine men feel like they're not males, or less than feminine women feel like they're not female. Okay, so this is I can sense some nods going up, because probably some of you are like, yeah, I don't match up to this kind of narrow box of masculinity or narrow box of femininity. So this is a problem, I think, in the church, is we have oftentimes unstatedly like made people who don't fit the majority feel like they're being immoral for not matching up with some cultural standard of masculinity. But also in certain forms of trans ideologies or gender ideologies, they kind of do the same thing. So let me pull up this chart here. And I see this all over the place, and it's bewildering how people don't see what they're doing. Like, so for this comes up a lot in parenting. I see this a lot in parenting when a parent will have a 6-year-old boy who's kind of acting in feminine ways, and people say, "Oh, well, your kid's probably trans." Why would my kid be trans? Well, your boy, he likes to wear pink, and he wants to grow his hair long. Wait. So does long hair and pink, does that define womanhood? Like, you can see how backwards this is. It's what's interesting is a lot of secular feminists are the ones who are ripping their house against kind of some trans ideology, because they're saying, wait a minute, you guys are using old patriarchal sexist stereotypes of what it means to be a woman, and you're using that as a foundation to determine whether your little girl or little boy is a boy or a girl. We spent 100 years as the feminist, different waves of feminism to not have to be stuffed into this little box of femininity. It's why, I mean, to be honest, to get a little cultural here, it's why a lot of feminists, I don't know if you know this, it didn't really make a lot of headlines, but a lot of feminists were kind of outraged when Caitlyn Jenner appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine in this seductive, sensual, persona, because the women are like, yeah, that's exactly how men want women to look. And this is resurrecting, dusting off and resurrecting old stereotypes of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and using it as a foundation to determine whether somebody's internal sense of self or whatever overrules their biology. So if you have this, if you look at this paradigm, if you have a very narrow, small view of what it means to be a man and woman, namely, if you're masculine, you're a man, if you're feminine, you're a woman, what if you don't fit that? Well, if you're my age, when you grew up in school, if you don't fit that narrow paradigm, no one said you're not a woman. They just said, you're kind of more of a tomboy. Or, they might have a more derogatory term for boys, but they wouldn't say you're not a boy. You're a boy who isn't very masculine. So what? Who cares? But with younger people today, if they don't fit that narrow stereotype, then there's a lot of cultural pressure to latch on to one of the myriad of different kind of gender identities. So they're almost elevating these gender stereotypes of masculinity and femininity and saying, if you don't match this, then maybe you're non-binary, demigirl, genderqueer, gender fluid, or whatever. But by doing so, all you're doing is giving life to these old stereotypes. The Bible, I think, is profoundly liberating. The Bible says and endorses, the Bible agrees with science that humans are sexually dimorphic, that male and female are the two sex categories. What I love about the Bible is it gives us a lot of freedom of what it means to live that out. You're a woman who wants to get married and stay at home and make babies and send your husband off to work. Awesome. If you're a woman who wants to go and win wars and drive tent pegs through men's skulls like Yael and Judges 4, you're still a woman. If you're a man who's like King David, who, you know, took out Goliath with the sling and taunted the Philistines, well, you be you, you masculine man. And when David turns around and plays his harp and writes poetry and cries all over the Psalter, and even says that his best friend Jonathan his love for Jonathan was greater than the love of women, you're still a man, Jonathan, or still a man, both Jonathan and David, because being a man isn't reduced to being masculine, stereotypically speaking. So I think the Bible is, I think it truly is the answer to how we navigate this conversation. Biological sex is real. It's binary. There's differences, statistically speaking, between how men and women, generally speaking, they act, but these typical ways in which men and women act are not morally mandated. There's freedom in what it means to live out your maleness and femaleness. All right, so let's just get a few practical questions here, thinking through pronouns and transitioning. So pronouns, big debate. It can be very complicated, the pronoun debate. Should Christians use the pronouns or preferred pronoun? Some people don't like the phrase preferred pronoun, by the way. That can be offensive to some trans people because the word preferred seems to diminish their desire to be called a different pronoun. Like, I prefer chocolate over ice cream, Pepsi over Coke. I prefer he, she over, he, or she, her over he, him, whatever. So some people say, well, it just kind of doesn't recognize the profundity. Is that a word? I haven't used that word in probably 3 years. Profundity of the reasons why I want to be called by a different pronoun. Anyway, but most people don't care. They've preferred pronoun is a fine phrase. I, generally speaking, do take what I call a pronoun hospitality approach. In order to meet someone where they're at, I'm going to use the pronouns they want me to use. I don't have to agree with it. I just have to meet them where they're at and, in a sense, accommodate to their understanding of how pronouns are used. I mean, the fact is, language is flexible, or as I put it, language is shared social space, right? So if you have person A over here, okay, so let's just say this is me, I'm this guy, and then you have a trans person over here, and I think pronouns refer to one's biological sex, and person B over here, a trans person, says, no, pronouns refer to gender identity, not biological sex. And I might, in my own mind, think gender identity. I'm not even sure that's. I don't think we should prioritize gender identity over sex, and I certainly don't think pronouns refer to gender identity, not sex. Okay, that's what I'm thinking, but that's not what they're thinking. Okay, so now what are we going to do? Language is shared social space. I can't relate to this person without sharing this shared social space. So somebody's going to have to give in. Most trans people will say, if you deliberately choose not to use my name and pronoun, I'm gone. Like I'm not. So because I see this as not a hill to die on, I'm going to use the person's pronoun as part of the shared social space. I can't demand that every human uses language that reflects my Christian worldview. We would be ineffective in the world. So I think this is one area where we can give in for the sake of meeting someone where they're at. Now, I want to propose, though, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, okay? So my thoughts are still not 100% ironed out here. I don't know if my thoughts ever 100% ironed out. I don't think it's usually wise for parents to use the pronouns of younger children. But when I say younger, I don't have a specific age in mind. Under parental care, under 16 and under. Once they start getting 17 and they're still under parental care there, but that's kind of like now they're that might be a little different. Certainly if your child's an adult, I would say, man, for the sake of staying in a relationship with them, use the pronouns they want you to use, especially if they're like, if you don't use my pronouns, you will never see me again. If they're an adult, then they're out of your care. You know, you don't have to agree with their decisions. You have to relate with them in the midst of them making decisions that you might not agree with. But when a 13, 14, 15-year-old is under your care, I think that might be a different story. Here's why. Cross-sex pronouns, or using different pronouns that don't match your biological sex, are a form of social transitioning. That's by definition. That's when we talk about social transitioning. It's mannerisms, clothing, hairstyle, and names and pronouns. That's all part of social transitioning. Some of these socially transitions that almost always leads to hormonal transition. Males taking high doses of estrogen, females taking high doses of testosterone. Oftentimes, hormonal transition leads to some form of surgical transition. So I've talked to a lot of psychologists about this. I've talked to a lot of parents about this. I've talked to a lot of counselors about this. I've talked to a lot of trans people about this. And a lot of them, at least, are saying if the parent uses the child's pronoun that's under their care, you are setting them on a path toward, or you're basically endorsing social transitioning and setting them on a path that will almost always lead to hormonal and surgical transitioning. And again, going back to my earlier point, I don't think, regardless of what you believe about the ethics of transitioning, I don't think a teenager should ever transition. I would die on that hill. If you're an adult, your brain's fully developed, then you be you. And for some people, transitioning does psychologically seem to bring a lot of relief, for some at least. That's not always long term. There's the classic 7 to 10 year mark that's known among the trans community, where 7 to 10 years after transitioning is oftentimes where the regret sometimes can sink in. But does a 15-year-old literally have the brain? I don't mean this in a derogatory way, just in a factual way. Do they have the brain, the ability to make a decision that is lifelong and irreversible? If they go on testosterone, if a female goes on testosterone for 2 years, she's most likely going to be infertile for life. Well, okay, at 15, she doesn't want to have a kid. Oh, I don't want to have kids. Okay, you're 15. Are you sure at 25 or 30 you're going to believe that? You don't know that. If you go on testosterone and you transition, unless you detransition, you're on it for life. So that means you're taking, I think it's 50 times the dosage that your body naturally produces. You're doing that at 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. When you stop doing that, your body starts to go back to your biological sex. Typically, you have severe atrophy in your ovaries and uterus, to where you're going to have to either have surgery, get those removed, or the high risk of blood clots, cancer, all kinds of stuff, lower lifespan. Okay, if an adult says, I know, yeah, okay, but I can't stand living in my biological sex, I need to do something. Okay, you're an adult. I'm not gonna. What am I going to say? You know, you're an adult. Make your decision. But if I am doing something as a parent that might be nudging them toward that profound decision that they can't appreciate at 15, as a parent, I think my job is to see around the corners of life and care for them and help them make decisions that they might not regret later on. That's what I'm thinking through right now. Now, there might be some exceptions to this with parents and kids. Some exceptions might be if the relationship is so fragile, so deteriorated, so bad that parental refusal to use their pronouns will cause them to leave the house, gone, done, no more relationship, nothing. Then I could see a place for a parent as sort of like an emergency measure to maintain some semblance of relationship with a kid, to accommodate and use their pronouns. Even then, though, I still think in the most loving, caring, humble, genuine way possible, that the parent should communicate that, hey, I will use your name, your pronoun, whatever you want, honey. I will do this for you. I'm doing this because you want me to. I don't believe that you were born in the wrong body, and I don't think I'm not ever going to, well, I wouldn't recommend or endorse you like transitioning, but if this is a way for me to stay in relationship with you, I will do this for you. But I wouldn't want to be dishonest. And this is something that's coming out more and more today, where somebody comes out as trans in school and everybody celebrates. There's a story a friend of mine told me about a girl who came out as trans and now identifies as a boy, and the whole class celebrates. They had a whole celebration party. I think in the UK you have to, like, it's kind of like a school custom. Like, if somebody comes out, you throw a celebration. Everybody's all excited. Oh, you're a boy. Yeah, they're all kind of nodding their heads. Sure, sure. But deep down, they're like, they don't really believe it. And so this girl who now identifies as a boy kind of wants to, I don't know how much later this was, but goes up and asks out another girl in class. And the girl's like, well, no, I'm not going to go out with you. I'm not a lesbian. Wait a minute. You were just celebrating my boyness a second ago. But deep down, they're like, I don't really believe her. So, and it was devastating for the person, because they really thought that everybody else that celebrated this actually believed the things they believed about themselves. So this is where I really want to promote the idea that clarity is kindness. Like, I do think it's good for us to be honest with what we believe, especially with our kids, even if we want to accommodate and say, kind of like my general approach to pronouns. Like, if I'm going to accommodate to somebody, it doesn't mean I actually do think they were born in the wrong body, or they are that, pronoun that they want me to use. I'm accommodating to their worldview. The parent, I think, would need to communicate that as well. I'm going to go quicker here. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, so if you do pick that up, I'll explain all this in much more detail. We do need to, as always, blend compassion and truth. Sit down with somebody who has transitioned. Spend an hour asking them to truly help you understand what they went through prior to making this decision. We need to have compassion on people who have taken great steps to solve some incongruence in their life. So we need to, as one of my trans friends says, sit in my puddle of tears with me for a little bit before you start making judgment calls. This is something I hope I emphasize enough at the beginning, and this posture should saturate everything we're talking about here. Okay. So we need to have profound compassion on people who have made this decision. That does not mean we agree with it, doesn't mean we advise it, but we can still empathize with people, even if we might not still agree with a decision they made. When I think about it conceptually, transitioning, there's kind of three lenses that I look at it through: ontological, ethical, and practical. Ontological is just, who are we? Is transitioning moving toward our authentic self or away from it? And honestly, so much of this comes down to how you view gender identity. Is gender identity the more authentic expression of who you are, or is your body the actual expression of who you are? I think it's the body. If there's incongruence, then your internal sense of self is not correct. And I want to help you to accept the factual reality of the biological sex that your creator has identified you as. Like, I want to help you move toward your authentic self. And that would be moving toward accepting your body as your human identity. So now, if you don't agree with that, then ontologically, you would have a case for transitioning, moving toward your authentic self, because your body's not your authentic self. But that assumes a whole different anthropology that I think resonates with the Christian worldview. Ethically, if biological sex is part of how we bear God's image in the world, then it does at least raise the ethical question: should we try to change that means by which God wants us to bear his image in the world? The body is not a morally neutral canvas upon which we have the freedom to do whatever we want. Paul makes this clear in 1 Corinthians 6. And it's many other places in Scripture. So I have yet to see a robust ethical argument for transitioning that reflects what I would say a robust Christian worldview. And practically, as many trans people have said, transitioning will not solve all your problems. For us, well, it's so disputed. I almost hesitate throwing out general statistics, but well, let me say, especially with teens, so many older trans people who are not Christians, who have transitioned, are screaming out saying, teenager, do not think, if you're dealing with depression and anxiety and you're lonely and you're just not doing well in life, you're wrestling with mental health issues, um, deal with that first. Do not think that transitioning will solve all that. There is no evidence that transitioning reduces one's mental or alleviates one's mental illnesses or mental health conditions. There's just no evidence for that. The only the most thorough long-term study we have on transitioning says that all the mental health stuff that people were wrestling with prior to transition was still there after transition, and that they were still 19 times more likely to attempt suicide as compared to the general population. So just practically, it's not like, well, I'm miserable now and this is going to solve that. It's kind of like, well, you're miserable now. Let's figure out maybe other explore ways to address that. Because if you transition, there's a chance maybe it'll reduce your dysphoria, and there's a chance you might be fully happy 10, 20 years after that, but you're just rolling the dice again. You might trade in one set of problems for a whole new set of problems, or add a whole new set of problems to a life that already has problems, which is why the suicide rate is very high for people post-transition. Lastly, don't let clickbait news headlines dictate where your heart is. Look, there are some crazy things going on in society today. With the Olympics coming up, I mean, that's a man, talk about a interesting conversation. I think we should think through that, various bathroom bills, various bills in general, what's being taught in schools. The Equality Act is, I think, extremely problematic on many different levels, and is wrongly worded. No female would have called it an Equality Act when you're, with the things that are stated in there. So that there's very real social issues, but if all we do is get riled up at the next clickbait headline by some news outlet that's losing money and needs you to click so that they can get sponsors and advertisements, that can't be the main thing that controls our hearts. There are people in our congregations who are significantly wrestling with their bodies on many different levels, or their parents of kids who are going through all kinds of stuff. We need to walk with people, love people, listen to people, embody Christ's truth and grace to the people that God has put under our care. So went a little long. Maybe a tad bit too long, but anyway, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I think we're going to go to a Q&A time, and somebody's going to moderate this for us. I hope you got some good questions.
Well, I think what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions. There's one question already. John, you want to read that one out and see?
Yeah, it's in regards to rapid onset. Can you see it, Dr. Sprinkle, or do you want me to read it out?
I've got it. Yeah, I can read it out. So when you say rapid onset and describe it with no evidence or out of nowhere, does this take into consideration statements or evidence provided by youth or primarily observations from parents? It's a great question. Let me explain it a little more. So I made the statement that teenagers under the rapid onset category kind of come home and say, I have gender dysphoria, I'm trans, and the parent says, you never experienced gender dysphoria. And so I said there's no evidence that they experienced it growing up as a kid. Now the question is, wait a minute, are we just relying on parents to tell us whether or not they had gender dysphoria? What if they had it all along and just didn't tell their parents? It's a great question, and it's a question here, but some people use that as a pushback, saying, well, these aloof parents weren't paying attention. So it's legitimate. Here's the only problem, though. If you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and look at the criteria for gender dysphoria, I think, don't quote me on this, but it's something like 9 different criteria, and if you need to match at least 5 or 6 of them to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, again, don't quote me on the exact numbers here, but if you look at the criteria, over half of them are by definition things that would be publicly manifested, like a persistent vocal desire to be the opposite sex, dressing in clothes that are characteristic of the opposite, like things that aren't just internalized, they are public manifestations, and especially as kids. So no, I do think it's very legit, I think, to say that there was no public evidence, which is part of the evidence for gender dysphoria, that was manifest to the parents. Could the parent has still been so aloof? Maybe they're working 3 jobs and they hardly ever see the kid. I mean, I guess that might be true in some extreme cases, but no, yeah, I think it's legitimate to say that the parent would have noticed this earlier.
I think for me, Preston, the question that comes up, and I really appreciated your conversation on the rapid onset, because it just started to make some sense to me, and looking at the trends kind of tied to that last question. So for our youth pastors here, or people that will listen later, maybe just a couple quick practical steps, because we're seeing in our own congregation, some of our students are in this place, non-binary or trans, and and then the youth leaders like, well, how do I love in this space? And
it's super hard. It's super hard because let's just say for the kid who is identifying as trans, non-binary, at least partly because of societal influence, okay, and maybe there's more than that, okay, but at least there's voices influencing them. Those voices are telling them, this is who you are, and you are trans. You have the right to choose your identity, and if you're experiencing the such and such, then you are trans. And if anybody doesn't agree with that or affirm that, they are toxic. You need to cut off those relationships. They are basically akin to Nazis and bullies, and you're already at high risk for suicide. And if you're around toxic people, there's a good chance you might end up just ending your life, which is the most psychologically irresponsible thing somebody could ever tell somebody, because suicidality is socially contagious itself. So you start telling people you might be suicide, you're only increasing that by doing that. It's so if somebody's bathing themselves in that way of thinking, anybody who doesn't fully affirm me is cut off, they're a hazard to my life, like quite literally, they are hazardous to my life. That's the narrative they're dealing with. So I think it's important for parents especially, and also youth leaders, to at least understand that might be the worldview of this person that they're dealing with. So if you come in and just start correcting or challenging, man, you're just gonna fit that profile, the very person that's toxic. So this is where I do think we have to be it can be a very fragile relationship. We have to come in, be extremely good listeners, to give evidence that you are a safe person. And one thing, I literally was just working on this morning, a project for parents. And the one thing I said is, parents should tell their kid, or youth leaders should tell these kids, that if they encounter any form of bullying or mocking or shame, that you will not tolerate that.
mm-hmm.
Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, at my son's school, you're way more likely to get bullied for being a white, straight, cis male Christian than being trans. If you're trans, you're like, it's like the script is kind of flipped in some circles, where now it's like no one would dare bully a trans, but either way. So even if your child is being celebrated by their identity, not being bullied, I think just they are still being told people are going to bully you, your family's going to. So I think verbalizing that you are out to protect them from bullying, I think that statement, that posture can help them say, oh, this person's safe. If they can come to truly believe that you are a safe person, that you are for them, that could open up more relational collateral for some very nuanced, I don't want to say challenges even, but helping disciple them, right? Helping disciple them in how the creator has designed them. And one of the short-term goals is I want to delay any kind of medical irreversible steps towards transitioning. That would be a bit, and how to do that? Well, you can't do that unless you're in a trusting relationship. Yeah. And one more thing, ultimately, the main thing is not their identity. The main thing is not their haircut. The main thing isn't even their hormones they might be wanting to take. The main thing is Jesus. We want them to know and love Jesus. If Jesus doesn't enter their life, if they don't have a radical encounter with the risen Christ, and everything else is just secondary. And I don't want to say meaningless, but it's a distant secondary. So don't make gender even the main thing. Make Jesus the main thing in your discipleship.
That's really good. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Wow.
Heavy topic, I know.
It's just like, I'm sure people are like, why do I even ask a question? Because it's just like my mind's gonna go.
Yeah.
But I so appreciate just your thoughtfulness on it. I think it's, I think for pastors and leaders, it is one of the open loops that's happening in our culture and society that we're facing. I have found, being a local church pastor, that especially in Southern California, that it seems like the adults that are in this category might not walk through my doors anyways, because they're online, they're Googling, they're finding their community in an open church of some sort, and which is fine. But this younger generation whose parents aren't even a part of the faith system, or they'll just walk in because they don't know any different, and their experience of that. And this next generation is just such an important part. And as a pastor, encountering some of the students that we have here at CCF, you just see such a despair in their heart, and it's just you're just trying to love in the midst of it all. But I think, one of the things we'll do after this is obviously share your resources with people. But is there one resource you would say right now? I know you're not a book pusher.
No, yeah.
What you've written has always been really encouraging and excellent to me. But if there's something you're like, this would be a great tool for some leaders just to work through together, which one would you recommend of the resources you have?
Yeah, I mean, I did write my book because I felt like there wasn't anything out there like it. There was some good stuff from a psychological perspective. There were some shorter things that were theological, but they kind of lacked the pastoral, or they had the pastoral and they lacked the theological, or they had the theological, they lacked kind of the science behind it, or they're just out of date. Like Rapid Onset was coined in 2018. So a book written in 2017 didn't even mention it, and now this is like the most probably widespread thing in the conversation. So I would, I mean, even if I didn't write this book, I would still recommend it as kind of the one-stop shop for Christian leaders. It's written with like Christian leaders, pastors, parents in mind. Okay. There's loads of stuff on, my podcast, I've got a lot, I probably have had 20 plus conversations with trans people on my podcast, which is also a YouTube channel. Just recently, I interviewed a guy named Scott Nugent, a fully transitioned, non-Christian trans man, so female to male, who is adamant, more adamant than me, that teens should not transition.
Wow.
As a fully transitioned trans man. And he's like, Preston, most older trans people think this is insane what's going on with teenagers today in the medical industry. It's insane. And he's pulling his hair out. He's like, how come people aren't screaming louder? So I had a whole, that just came out last week. I had another conversation with a detransition person named Daisy Shadra. Again, not a Christian. So I would check out, just Google my name or put my name in YouTube, and there's just scroll down, lots of just different conversations. I just gave a link to a YouTube conversation. This was at the recent Q conference, not QAnon, my gosh, but Q Ideas. It's a talk I gave with Helena Kirshner, who is the epitome of somebody who went through rapid onset gender dysphoria. So I gave like a 6-minute talk, and then I interviewed her for like 12 minutes. Her 12 minutes, I sat there thinking, every word that came from her mouth is both shocking and frightening, but also profound. I would highly recommend, if anybody wants to dig a little bit more into the rapid onset, 20-minute YouTube video, highly produced. It's done well, that I think would be a great introduction. Yeah, so that would probably keep you busy for a while. Go on our website, centerforfaith.com, and we have lots of stuff that keeps coming out there.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, that's really helpful. And I know we're talking about how we can get some of these resources into our pastors and leaders' hands, and then John just put that up, of course. I see some questions. There's a question that's more directed to a superintendent denominational polity question, which I can answer aside to that person or to the group. But the second question looks like you might be able to help us with that one.
Yeah. So you mentioned suicidality is socially contagious. LGBTQ practice is widely accepted in our society. Are there any socially contagious best practices that you use to combat the acceptability of LGBTQ practice among youth? I mean, this is the $1 million question. I would, man, we are losing this battle. I mean, if you think about how frightening this scenario is. How often are teenagers thinking about sex and or their bodies? How many hours of the day? Then how many hours do they spend online absorbing ideology worldviews that aren't necessarily Christian? Okay, now how many hours, and this isn't here to shame anybody, okay? How many hours do we Christian leaders spend constructing a Christian view of the body, sex, sexuality, gender identity? Like the mismatch of how much is going in that's probably unhelpful and how much is coming in that is helpful it's serious, really. I think we created a whole a video-based curriculum called Christian Sexuality. You can put the link up there, Christian Sexuality. It's almost like a movement we tried to create that is helping Christian teens understand, engage, and believe and embrace a Christian view of sex, sexuality, gender. It deals with everything from porn to singleness to marriage to masturbation to VR sex to trans stuff. I mean, it's a whole one-stop shop. So we created that because to answer this, like, we need to grab hold of our youth early on and help them to understand the Creator's vision for what it means to flourish as a human with our sexuality and our bodies, because they're going to be just bombarded with everything that's not Christian from a very early age. So positive Christian teaching early on of a Christian worldview. Also, I mean, the kind of elephant in the room thing that often goes unstated, or at least not addressed hard enough, is online usage and social media and phones. It is, I mean, since we know, it's not if anymore, but since we know that heavy online social media usage has sent anxiety, depression, and suicidality through the roof, especially among teens. Goodness, shouldn't we address that? Since we know that phones are highly addictive, even adults that use them for 3 hours a day are on a screen 3 hours a day. Sherry Turkle talks about like a cocooning effect on your brain, and it actually dulls your moral sensibility. It makes you apathetic, makes you addicted. I mean, it's just, all these things are not disputed. So I think a massive part of discipleship, not just in this conversation, but just as a whole, but especially this conversation, is helping kids early on to steward their screens in a way that's not going to destroy them. I don't want to be overly alarmist. I've got a phone. I battle this all the time, so it's not like I'm not, but man, we need to really disciple our youth well, because it's really, we don't really realize the moral or social ramifications that this heavy online or even social media use is happening, especially among younger people.
Oh, that's great. We're almost at the top of our time there, but there was another question thrown at you. I think if you can just briefly do that, and then I'll engage the first question quickly, and then I'll pray us out.
How do we regain credibility? I love this question. In these conversations around gender and sexuality, and Christians have also caused a lot of harm in these conversations. Real quick, I think just acknowledging that, like some Christians are scared to acknowledge that. And I understand if all we do is talk about how bad the church is, like that can be one-sided too. But yeah, we need to humbly recognize that, man, Christianity, Christian culture hasn't been the most, helpful for people wrestling with their sexuality or gender. I think just even acknowledging that's a good place to start. Often those previous conversations were motivated out of fear. Yep, we've gone about this, and we still do. How do we protect young sheep and yet not succumb to being motivated by fear? Yeah, I mean, that's again, be hard to answer succinctly, but I think, I mean, this is going to sound cliche, and you guys already know this, but I think practically and tangibly loving LGBT people in particular well, listening, loving, listening to stories, apologizing for how they might have been mistreated by the church. See, a fear-based approach says, no, if we do that, then we're kind of turning our back on the truth, or they need the truth. And it's like, well, they do need the truth, but they're not going to receive it from you until they feel that unless they know you love them. So it's out of concern for truth that we need to aggressively love people well. And also, I would also say, I mean, I think we do need to give up some control. I think again, the fear-based approach is if we don't do this well, if we don't preach Romans 1 enough, then our whole church is going to turn gay. Or, I mean, not quite, but I mean, I think there is even a lot of fear-driven approaches in how we, preach or teach on this topic. And we need, at the end of the day, believe what God says in his word and trust that God's spirit will work, trust God's work and our LGBT sons and daughters, and our friends and people. It seems like they're so lost and like, what do we do? It's like, well, you can't control the situation. Our job is to be faithful, embody the grace and truth of Jesus. But at the end of the day, have this joyful confidence that God will move. May not move in the way we want him to, might not all work out in the end. But at the end of the day, God's got to grab hold of the heart and bring him to himself.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I'm going to pray for you in just 1 second because I know we need to wrap up. But in response to the person's question for the superintendents, we will send out a resource sheet afterwards. I feel like our denomination has pretty clear positions on where we are with our leadership involvement, particularly with the LGBTQ question, and how that works at different layers of leadership. Our Scott has done a good job in looking at this, particularly from our Wesleyan theological perspective, which is important. I met Preston 4 years ago when I began this journey as superintendent, and he was already having conversation with our previous bishops about this already. I'm grateful as a church family. It's not something we're shocked and surprised by. Yet I also realize that on the East and the West coasts of our denomination are probably challenged and facing it more in our bigger cities in Southern California than what I would call the flyover states, who tend to be a little bit more conservative and don't want to even talk about it. But it is something we cannot avoid. And to say that we can turn a blind eye would be inappropriate, or an inappropriate way to handle Scripture or our leadership and to model Jesus. So I'm happy to do an online conversation, whoever the anonymous attendee is. But we will send out some responses to that so that you have some practical things that pastors and leaders can think through as engaging and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate as a Free Methodist family. So thank you for that question. Not wanting to avoid it, we just kind of ran a little out of time, but certainly want to engage in that. Well, Preston, thank you so much for being with us. I'm just so grateful again. Every time I get to hear you share, my mind is expanded and my heart is expanded towards the compassion, towards just people in general, regardless of the alphabet, just people in general, of how to navigate this new season. And I would just prophetically say, this is where it's at right now. And what will it look like the next 10 years? And I feel like how we steward this moment is going to determine the leadership of not only our denomination, but so many of the kingdom groups that are happening. And, even someone who's so closely tied to us in our theological heritage is right in the midst of what that will look like as a denomination. I hope that we can be more proactive and more prophetic and more loving in this next season. while yet staying very clear to our biblical roots. But I just thank you that you're on the leading edge and you're helping us navigate that and open the conversation and presenting some hard truths for us to really explore.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. That means a lot.
Well, I'm going to pray for you. I'll let the people get back to where they need to go. And again, thank you so much for being with us. We're just blessed to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Holy Spirit, what a rich conversation. I know my mind has just got 1,000 things going on right now, and how I can love better, how I can walk better, how I can listen better. That just really spoke to me. And God, for this next generation and for those who are welcomed into our churches, help us to have these conversations. Lord, help us not to avoid, help us not to assume, help us to listen to hearts. And God, I just pray for Preston, his ministry, his family, as he navigates that. And I am sure there's a whole other level of battle that is upon him. So encourage him, surround him even right now. And may he just feel your good pleasure as you love the Imago Dei. And here's one of your servants proclaiming the truth of what you want us to be as image bearers. So strengthen him, enlighten him, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.